How early settlers prepared for a winter that could last forever. Relaxing history, long before thermostats, fleece pajamas, and weather apps that pretend they know next Tuesday's temperature better than we know our own schedule. There were settlers, early settlers, the kind of people who greeted winter the way one might greet a stampede, stoically, with clenched jaws, and a full knowledge that at least one aunt was going to be hit by a flying sled. To say winters were long would be like saying porridge was beige. You are technically correct, but entirely unprepared for the depth of commitment involved. Now imagine you're in early colonial New England. It's 3:47 p.m. and practically midnight. The sun has tapped out like a junior intern, and the temperature has plummeted with a level of enthusiasm only January can offer. But winter's approach wasn't a surprise, not because there were forecasts, but because every squirrel in the village had started giving humans judgmental stares, as if to say, "You're still not done splitting wood." The preparations began in late August, or, as it was known on the settler calendar, time to worry about winter, immediately following time to pretend the heat isn't that bad. Gardens were harvested, vegetables stored, and salting meat became a full-time job. If you were lucky, you had a proper smokehouse out back. If you were less lucky, your spare bedroom doubled as a briny closet of regret, where a leg of pork dangled ominously over Grandma's sewing chair. Clothing was layered with all the finesse of a marshmallow attempting ballet. Wool underwear, wool stockings, a wool dress, shawl, and a hat knitted by someone whose only instruction was, make it big enough to cover a deep existential dread. They bundled up like human cornucopias, ready to trudge through snowdrift avalanches that reached suspiciously close to the attic windows. Cabins themselves were masterpieces of minimalist survival. One room, one hearth, no insulation, unless you count the space between logs and the questionable engineering of moss and ambition. Settlers knew they'd spend most of winter around that single fire like it was a celebrity, and every ember its glowing autograph. Furniture was pulled closer to the hearth as December deepened, until the family table threatened to spontaneously combust from proximity. And yet, they didn't just survive. They lived, they adapted, they made stew. Lots and lots of stew. Stew was not just a meal, it was an activity, a profession, a lifestyle. You'd start the pot with morning onions, add some root vegetables around lunch, and by dusk, it had become a flavor profile so complex it probably deserved its own diary. Recipes weren't so much written down as passed on through cryptic murmurs like, "Toss in whatever still looks slightly edible, dear." Now, of course, preservation was key. There was no refrigerator, but there was a chamber pot and many a lesson to be learned about not storing salted cod too close to it. Apples were wrapped in straw and stored in barrels, hung high so mice couldn't throw surprise dinner parties. Cabbage was encouraged to become sauerkraut, a process that, much like growing bangs, seemed like a good idea until the house smelled like confused vinegar. Despite all this, boredom loomed uninvited. Winter had a cruel sense of humor. Your hands were too cold to sew, and yet your brain was too unraveled not to start a wildly frustrating embroidery project. Children learned storytelling, shadow puppetry, and how to play chess with pieces made of carved potatoes. Yes, by early February, it was entirely possible to lose a rook to soup. Neighbors were both saviors and suspects. You relied on them for companionship and occasionally someone to gently blame for your mysteriously disappearing firewood. Community mattered deeply in these days. If your cabin door swung open and it wasn't a bear, it was probably your neighbor, Jebediah, stopping by to borrow some salt, in the same way one might borrow the moon, a slippery concept born mostly of shared desperation. And when silence prevailed, when the snow fell thick and the wind behaved like it held a grudge, their thoughts drifted back to each other, to warmer seasons, and to the hope that the maple sap would run sweet when spring returned. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, as the cold wind howls softly through the thatched window cracks, and the hearth's last embers glow a sleepy orange, our tale gently carries you across snow-covered time. The wind always came early in November. It crawled down from the tree line like a shy but determined dinner guest, carrying the scent of pine needles, wood smoke, and the faint, suspicious whiff of something long expired in the root cellar. The settlers, wrapped in wool and weary wisdom, knew the signs well. A winter wasn't just coming, it was limbering up in the wings, humming ominously and browsing its favorite tricks from winters past. And so, preparation began in earnest. And by earnest, I mean frantic, relentless, and exactly 10 months too late. The turkey was still pecking around the barn. The chimney hadn't been cleaned since Paul tripped over the squirrel in February. And half the turnips from September's harvest were now dedicated to a rather robust mole study of their own. Nevertheless, they had traditions, like stacking firewood in such colossal piles that they looked less like preparation and more like a delayed Viking funeral for the entire village, or rendering lard into candles so smoky and dim that reading by them involved squinting for an hour and still not knowing who stole your socks. But it was tradition, and tradition was comforting, even if it sometimes smelled like goat. Preserving food was less a hobby and more a state of emergency with mason jars. The women would gather in the kitchens with aprons strapped on like armor and start the great jam consolidation of 1789 of course, though the strawberries had been clinging on since 1687 if you asked old Mrs. Wellingworth. Cabbage, that noble, sulphurous beast, had its own journey. It was chopped, salted, packed, and transformed into sauerkraut, the fermented backbone of winter survival, and a reliable crowd clearer at parlor gatherings. Root vegetables were gently escorted into their earthy dormitories, onion, carrot, potato, stacked with love and vague hope that months from now they wouldn't all taste like despair. And then came the sealing of the home. No romantic process this. It involves stuffing sheep's wool into every visible crack, pinning rugs to walls as insulation, and tacking oiled paper over windows. When done with sufficient skill and number of nails, this turned your average frontier cabin from a loose suggestion of a dwelling into something approximating a very chilly cave. But with biscuits, mothers would walk through the rooms humming ancient lullabies, partly to soothe the children, and partly to politely inform the mice that their tenancy was up for renegotiation. Fathers, meanwhile, examined roofs like somber philosophers, staring at each shingle as if contemplating the meaning of snow. Blankets were distributed using a strict, unwritten family hierarchy. The baby got the best one, Grandpa got whatever he insisted was best, and everyone else got blankets thin enough to read through. The saying went, if you can feel your toes, someone else is colder than you. But perhaps the strangest part of winter preparations wasn't the stacking or the salting or even the sudden panic about wool socks. It was the storytelling. As nights grew longer and the stars played their slow, glittering opera, people began to trade more than goods. They traded tales, stories about winters so cold the milk froze in the goat, Stories about blizzards that lasted entire months, only sparing the outhouse because it was apparently sacred to the snow gods. They repeated legends about the settler who built an igloo out of bread loaves and survived a week on eyebrow icicles and raw hope. Silly? Absolutely. But these stories did something clever. They wrapped fear in laughter and hardship in folklore. After all, when you're bracing for a season in which an outdoor trip to the privy required a pre-navigated escape route and possibly a will, it helped to laugh. Even the children had their own rituals. They collected kindling like squirrels on performance-enhancing nuts, proud and purposeful, and adopted muddy feral cats who promptly refused to contribute in any way to the heating system. Yet somehow, it worked. The warmth came not from the hearth, but from the weaving together of old habits, shared rooms, and communal grumbling. Outside, the sky yawned deeper into dusk. Amber light flickered from windows like sleepy eyes slowly closing. The wind tiptoed past the eaves with a whistle that could have been a lullaby or a warning. And still, inside, the settlers whispered and stacked and knitted, seeking that delicate balance between preparation and fortune-telling. For winter was almost here. But first, there was the small matter of surviving the final harvest dance with minimal frostbite and maximum romantic mischief. It was early October, which for the early settlers of New England meant one thing: time to start panicking slightly more than usual. There was no Doppler radar, no local weather report, and certainly no smartphone app called Will It Snow Forever. There were just stiff breezes, migrating geese, and the ominous rustle of dry leaves. Nature's version of a group stage whisper telling everyone to grab their woolen socks and prepare to eat a great deal of turnip. Picture a tiny village clearing, just a cluster of timber homes with chimneys that puffed like drowsy dragons. Here, chickens pecked anxiously at the frozen ground, and settlers tugged their cloaks tighter, hoping they hadn't accidentally used their only good blanket to insulate the pigsty again. Winter was coming, possibly forever. Again. Now, to prepare for this perpetually impending ice age, the settlers didn't just hoard food. They built a lifestyle around the possibility of being snowed in until spring, or the second coming, whichever came first. Let's begin with the firewood, which wasn't so much a resource as it was a religion. Settlers calculated how many logs they'd need down to the twig. The formula went something like more, just more. A good settler household might burn through 30 to 40 cords of wood in a harsh winter. That's a stack of logs about as long and high as a whale the size of an elephant wearing mittens. Chopping firewood was everyone's job. Even the children had tiny axes for practice and minor injuries. There was no Netflix after all. Splinters and teamwork were the early settler equivalent of binge-watching. Inside the homes, things were equally cozy and slightly smoky. Windows were covered with oiled paper instead of glass, transparent enough to let in light, but not so clear that you could see your neighbors being chased by a goose, which was likely for the best. If there were gaps in the walls, and there always were, they'd get stuffed with moss, rags, or whatever the family wasn't currently wearing. Food preservation was where things became ingeniously mundane. Pickling was a sacred rite. If it could sit still in a vinegar bath, it got pickled. Eggs, pickled. Beets, pickled. Disagreements about what could be pickled, also pickled and stored in a large jar marked miscellaneous. Meat faced a variety of dignified ends: salting, smoking, drying above the hearth until it acquired a flavorful layer of ash. Each method had its champions. A smoked ham hanging from the rafters wasn't just dinner, It was a statement piece, a conversation starter, and occasionally an accidental helmet for tall guests in low-ceilinged cabins. Root cellars became underground realms where time stood still, but cabbages multiplied mysteriously. The cellars were cool, damp, and delightfully spooky. They were also a reliable hiding spot when Aunt Bertha insisted on singing seasonal ballads about tuberculosis. Quilting bees became social events of surprisingly strategic significance. Women gathered to stitch layers of fabric together and share helpful gossip, like whose pantry smelled of spoiled eel, or who had tried to milk their goat while sleepwalking. It was community bonding, resource management, and textile efficiency, all sewn into one patchworked masterpiece. And let's not forget clothes, layered in such creative abundance that it took upwards of 20 minutes to prepare for a trip to the outhouse. Wool was prized, of course, but linsey woolsey, a blend of linen and wool, was the real fashion statement. It itched like betrayal, but it was warm. And that's all anyone really asked for back then, to be not cold, and ideally not on fire. Children were swaddled like burritos in hand-me-downs piled upon hand-me-downs. Tall boots had newspaper insulation. Mittens were tied together and looped through sleeves in defiance of gravity and good taste. Everyone accepted that during winter, fashion took a long nap. As the days grew shorter and shadows stretched across snow-dusted fields, settlers tightened their preparations like hibernating bears with a checklist. The sky turned pewter, fires crackled drowsily, and provisions settled into their crocks and baskets like sleepy passengers on a ship made of pine and prayer. And just when the wind began to howl in earnest, when frost painted the windows with its delicate icy graffiti, it was time to turn inward and embrace the quiet, not in fear, but in practiced, stubborn comfort. Next, we shall peer a little closer inside those timber walls to understand how people entertained themselves when snow made every road a whispered no. The first frost crept in like a polite ghost, brushing silver over root cellar doors and making every wooden beam groan like an old man remembering youth. This was the cue, the silent trumpet call, for settlers to begin. Well, panicking, albeit in a quiet, organized sort of way. After all, in the 17th century, winter preparation wasn't a Pinterest board of knitted throw blankets and apple-scented candles. It was survival, sealed in beeswax and hope. Settlers knew that once the snow came, it could fall like an uninvited guest with no intention of ever leaving. The kind of winter that settled not just over the land, but deep into your bones. And so, every motion in late autumn was deliberate. Every chicken chased, every log chopped, every barrel salted was a verse in the quiet hymn of preparation. The goal was simple: to do so much work now that you could do dramatically less work later, preferably while sitting by the fire with slightly numb toes. Food, of course, was the headliner in the seasonal drama. You couldn't just pop down to the corner shop for milk, mostly because there was no corner, also no shop. And milk itself was a daily negotiation with your cow, who did not enjoy winter one bit. So families preserved what they could. Cabbages were buried, apples were dried, stacked, and hoarded like edible coins. Meats were smoked until they could outlast a papal reign. Codfish, salted so thoroughly it could be used as a weapon, became both sustenance and seasoning. But perhaps the most oddly charming part of this era was butter. Butter was currency, confession, and comfort. It was made in frenzied batches before the cow's milk dried up for the season. Women churned like their lives depended on it, which, inconveniently, they often did. Imagine, Entire rustic kitchens pulsing with the rhythm of churns, cream transforming slowly, magically, into something golden and eternal. Well, eternal-ish. It lasted until the spring, or until someone gave into temptation and just had a bit more on their bread. Meanwhile, the men, those with big coats and bigger axes, busied themselves with splitting logs. A seemingly never-ending stack of firewood needed to appear outside every homestead, like a wooden fortress against the cold. There's a saying, you know, that firewood warms you twice. Once when you chop it, and again when you burn it. But in those days, it probably warmed you 6 or 7 times, given how often they had to restack it, dry it, curse at it, and explain to an in-law why it still wasn't enough. And oh, the clothing. Preparing for winter meant dressing like a particularly anxious onion, layer upon layer upon layer. Wool was king, and flax was the loyal, if scratchy courtier. Children were bundled within inches of visibility. The more wool you had, the richer you appeared, but the itchier your afternoons. Settlers learned, over time, that soft wasn't an option. Everything had to be sturdy, patchable, and willing to absorb more snow than a thatched roof after a hailstorm. One might wonder if they ever stopped, if they ever sat, watched a snowflake drift past the candlelit window, and felt the quiet pride of preparation well done. The answer is occasionally. Brief moments by the fire, feet outstretched, a mug of something questionably fermented in hand. Perhaps someone would even hum a tune, or flat out invent one, depending on the quality of the homemade cider. Still, there was one more thing left to do after the food was stored. The wood was stacked, and the windows stopped rattling. They waited. Not in fear exactly, just with the respectful anxiety one reserves for things like storms and clergy visits. Because winter, for all its beauty, could be stubborn. And unlike your marriage or your vegetables, it didn't respond well to negotiation. Outside, the woods hushed under the pale light of early snow. Inside, boots dried slowly by the hearth, giving off gentle wafts of smoked leather and earth. The kettle began to sing, and somewhere in the distance, a pair of mittens was being frantically searched for. Now that the homes were fit for the cold, it was time to turn inward, to repair what was broken, to reflect, and maybe, just maybe, to bake something that wasn't entirely necessary for survival. But first, the matter of sealing the windows with whatever materials could be spared without causing a minor domestic scandal. Far from the churning shores and hungry frost, somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the reach of the civilized world's arguments about taxation, etiquette, and powdered wigs, early settlers turned their focus from philosophy to firewood, perhaps the most philosophical act of all, when faced with 8 months of possible snow. By October's breath, the leaves had performed their annual vanishing act, spectacularly dramatic, as always, and dropped to reveal the bare skeletons of trees, like the forests were getting ready for an old New England funeral. This was the settler's cue. It was time to start stacking wood like one's life depended on it. Because, quaintly enough, it did. Woodpiles became both necessity and status symbol. A man might know Latin, be able to quote Cicero between sips of cider, but if his woodpile was scant and wobbly, well, even the squirrels would pity him. The ideal stack was tall, stable, and this was very important, protected from rain, wind, visiting goats, and small children with a fondness for climbing things they shouldn't. The types of wood were known like extended family: maple for good, clean heat, oak for long burns and dignity. Pine? Well, pine was to be used in a pinch, reluctantly, with a warning glance, exchanged between the eldest and the chimney flue. Pine burned hot but dirty, leaving behind creosote and regrets. Like the X of firewood, most settlers kept a mental ledger of how many cords were needed for the season. One cord, a stack measuring roughly 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long, was enough to keep a small cottage warm for a while. Just a while. For a lengthy winter, you needed at least 5. More if your roof leaked, or if your in-laws were visiting and frowned upon shivering. To gather wood was not merely a chore. It was a whispered ritual. Men and women trudged into the thinning woods with saws, axes, and a reassuring amount of stubbornness. Trees were selected with reverence, and occasionally with apology. Some settlers even thanked them before the felling. Others sang to themselves, partly to pass the time and partly to ensure the bears knew they were coming. They chopped, they hauled, they stacked. It took weeks. Occasionally, one optimistic fellow might build a clever lean-to out of wood scraps, then discover in December that cleverness was no match for 40 below winds with something to prove. And it wasn't just firewood that needed special treatment. Food did too. Root cellars, those humble caverns dug beneath homes, were stocked like underground grocery stores with turnips, potatoes, onions, cabbage, anything that could hibernate underground without forming opinions or growing legs. Preservation was the name of the game, and it was a game played with vinegar, salt, and a lot of squinting. Meat was cured and smoked, often hung in curious places like attic beams or barn rafters, guarded against curious cats and disapproving spouses. Pickling was both art and insurance. Rows and rows of jars rose like stained glass on cellar shelves. Green beans, beets, apples, and mysterious things once identified but now safely submerged in brine. Children were enlisted, willingly or otherwise, to string apples for drying. This task would stretch entire afternoons, the strings eventually hung by hearths or in warm attics, creating rustic garlands that somehow always included one apple slice taste-tested every few minutes. For quality control. And then there was the matter of socks. Woolen, homemade, slightly itchy, always mismatched. Winter preparation meant sock production ramped up to a cozy frenzy. Everyone, regardless of age or dexterity, learned to knit, or at least to pretend convincingly until someone else offered to do it for them. Bundles of yarn were treated like treasure, traded like currency, and occasionally fought over like politics. Even the animals had preparation plans. Chickens received insulated coops, with varied success, while cows were given thick bedding and pep talks. Hens were encouraged to continue laying through the winter with the promise of obscure rewards. Whether this worked or not remains unclear, as most hens held tightly to their union rules about off-season labor. So it went, with wool and wood and pickles and patience. As the days shortened and the air began to smell faintly of snow and chimney smoke, the settlers began to hunker. Not hide, but hunker. A sacred crouch, shoulders against the storm, soup bubbling nearby, one eye on the window, the other on the knitting. They might not have had much, just a rough cabin, a modest pantry, a very thick blanket of hope. But they had what they needed to outlast whatever winter had in its frozen bag of tricks. And just as the first flakes began to drift through the air like bashful visitors arriving too early to a party, someone remembered. They still hadn't fixed that one squeaky shutter. But that could wait. There was cider to simmer, pages to turn, tales to tell. Soon the snow would deepen, and the world would become quiet and white. But first will drift toward what settlers wore when the days grew colder, and fashion met function in the most adorably rustic of ways. In the hush of late autumn, when the trees had long since dropped their gowns of fire-colored leaves, the early settlers turned their minds to a quiet panic, surviving winter. Not just any winter, but winter the way Mother Nature used to make it. The kind that knocked politely in November, then kicked the door in by December and hung around like an overfed bear until April. Without the luxury of thermostats, space heaters, or emergency hot cocoa packets, invented centuries later at a critical global summit known as Snow Day with Nana, settlers relied on sheer resourcefulness and rather a lot of layering, linen, wool, and whatever dignity remained. But before they could become blanket burritos beside a wood stove, work had to be done. Now, never let it be said that early settlers were a lazy bunch. In fact, by mid-November, every able person was so soaked in busyness they practically oozed beeswax. Pantries had to be filled, not with delicate shelf-stable snacks, but with heaving barrels of salted meat, sacks of flour, and root vegetables stashed beneath the floorboards like contraband turnips. It was said that if you dropped a potato in any given cabin in New England during the 1600s, there was a 70% chance it would roll into a secret root cellar. The fungi alone had squatters' rights. Wool, the MVP of winterwear, was carded, spun, woven, and worn until it grew sentient. Mittens were stitched from old felt hats. Capes were fashioned from curtains. And if clothing was in short supply, neighbors did what neighbors do best, quietly judged you while secretly helping. Somewhere in a frosty hollow, an old lady was always knitting. Always. Even children weren't spared. They were handed small winter prep duties like gathering kindling, feeding chickens that aggressively resented the snow, and churning butter until their arms resembled rustic sculptures. They slept well, probably because they collapsed. To the untrained modern eye, much of the preparation might have looked like bustling chaos, but to the seasoned settler, it was an elegant symphony of survival. Dry herbs hung like upside-down bouquets from every beam. Knotted sachets filled with dried rosemary, lavender, and mystery leaves, possibly oregano, possibly accidental pine needles, scented the air, which they swore kept colds away, and neighbors too, if the scent was strong enough. Let us not forget illumination. Long nights required light, and not the easy flick-of-a-switch variety. No, settlers lit by candle, whale oil, or in desperate times, a pine knot that burned with the enthusiasm of something that shouldn't have been indoors. Candles were precious and handmade, often from tallow, also known as beef fat, poured into molds or dipped with patience into little stubby cones. The warm glow soothed the spirit, though it smelled unmistakably like last Sunday's stew. Entertainment was also prepared. Yes, even in the frigid stillness of winter, humans required storytelling. Settlers would pass the time with tales passed down by firelight, often featuring supernatural happenings, suspicious goats, and moral lessons best described as unclear but mildly alarming. If your great aunt was telling the story, it likely ended in someone mysteriously vanishing and everyone pretending it was fine. Window panes, if they had them, were protected with makeshift insulation. Oiled paper, heavy shutters, or dense curtains made from the collective regrets of every child asked to weave them. Cracks were stuffed with wool, moss, or linen scraps, sealing in the warmth and, most critically, keeping out the absolute audacity of winter's draft. And then there was the ritual of firewood stacking. Not just any stacking, mind you. This was a form of art. A properly stacked woodpile was a message to nature herself. Come at me. From neatly split logs to the great unsplit rounds destined to humble any arrogant axeman, the woodpile was both fortress and pride. Woe to the man who built a crooked pile. It would fall, alert the neighbors, and mark you forever as that one guy who angered the kindling spirits. As twilight whispered earlier each day and the first true frost traced lace across the windows, cabins stirred with a quiet sense of completion. Winter was coming, with its slow silences, its long evenings, and the kind of cold that knit families together out of sheer necessity. Beyond the forest edge, snowflakes coughed politely in the sky, rehearsing their descent, and somewhere, a voice hummed softly into the hush, preparing, perhaps, to tell a story by candlelight about a stranger among the trees. The last pumpkins had been dragged inside, their dusty orange skins dimpling from the cold, and the frost on the window panes now etched fractal patterns that looked suspiciously festive. If by festive you meant impending doom wrapped in ice. And yet, in their quiet, methodical way, the early settlers made their preparations, without panic, just a healthy sense of gloom. One of the more curious rituals of pre-winter life was the great posseting. A posset, in case your vocabulary has suffered from modernity, was a hot drink made from milk curdled with ale or wine and spiced with nutmeg or ginger. Think of it as a warm, boozy milkshake one might consume in the hope that calories and alcohol would collude to keep out the chill. It tasted historically accurate. And while it was hardly what anyone would serve at a modern dinner party, unless you'd like your guest to experience regret, it was considered medicine, merriment, and meal all in one. By late November, chimneys across every makeshift township smoked like sleepy volcanoes. Woodpiles stood like Jenga towers that no one was allowed to touch, lest it mess up all those carefully stacked birch logs. Cutting firewood had by now evolved into an art form and a competitive sport. You really haven't known awkward tension until you've seen two colonial men silently judge each other's woodpiles with squinted eyes and slow nods. And speaking of firewood, some settlers measured their preparedness not by how many axes they owned, though that was a source of pride, but by how many cords they stacked before the first snowfall. A cord, for reference, is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. A standardized measurement used primarily by people who had no choice but to think constantly about staying warm or freezing into a cautionary anecdote. But physical fuel was only half the battle. There was also the sacred household ritual known as the beef salting. Before refrigeration graced our lives with its humming convenience, the act of preserving meat required not only salt, but also patience, space, and a high tolerance for everything smelling faintly of beef. The family cow, if sufficiently unproductive or unlucky, was led with gravity into its final winter contribution. Afterward, slabs of meat were packed into barrels of salt, layer upon layer, until the whole thing resembled a carnivorous parfait. It was not delicate work, nor particularly fragrant, but come January, that salted beef would become the star of the dinner plate, served with boiled roots and a firm belief that flavor was, perhaps, an optional detail. Root cellars, those underground pantries carved into hillsides or burrowed below houses, now sat swollen with potatoes, turnips, and onions. Vegetables chosen not for their glamour, but for their outstanding ability to not die during cold months. Picture Cinderella's magical pumpkin carriage, But instead of whisking you away to a royal ball, it sits underground for 5 months next to your backup onions. Practicality always wins in the end. Apples were stored in barrels lined with straw, kept in cool corners to delay their transformation into fruit mush. Some settlers dried them instead, slicing them into thin rounds, stringing them like garlands, and hanging them in the rafters like edible decorations that even the mice admired from a distance. Beyond food and fire, there was the psychological preparation, the slow convincing of the soul that this winter would not, in fact, last forever. For this, many households turned to books, Bibles, and, when available, the much-anticipated Farmer's Almanac, which confidently predicted either a mild winter or certain doom, depending on the page you landed on. Children were taught to darn socks and mend mittens, while older generations took to storytelling, their voices carrying tales as warm as the hearth and as stretched as the old wool blankets. To pass the time, settlers often engaged in nightly entertainments involving reading aloud, playing simple instruments, or sliding gradually into existential pondering by candlelight. After all, what better time to question the meaning of life than when stuck indoors with a limited cheese supply? Yet amid all this hearty preparation and quiet bravery, there was also always a pause, a moment, often at twilight, when a settler might step out into the stinging air, gaze up at the deepening blue sky, and think, perhaps we'll see the spring again after all. And so, with salted meat sleeping in barrels and firewood stacked like fortress walls, they headed back inside, ready for the long, resting silence of snow. Nestled within that silence, in dim candlelight and creaking floorboards, a plan began to stir, one that smelled faintly of spruce resin, beeswax, and maybe, just maybe, an idea for winter fashion that wouldn't freeze your neck solid. As the low sun slipped behind the skeletal trees and the frost spread its silvery lace across the fields, survival among the early settlers tiptoed from practical planning into the fine art of polite hoarding. You see, in the golden haze of late autumn, before the ground stiffened into granite and the rivers forgot how to flow, settlers began the great tucking in. Everything had to be tucked. Root vegetables into cellars, livestock into barns, children into knitted garments of questionable softness. One could fairly say that wool was the season's official fabric, charmingly itchy, and blessed with the ability to smell like wet biscuits whenever snow touched it. Which was often. But nothing brought the community together quite like the sacred gathering known as stuffing the house until only your nose can move. This time of year, it became an unspoken competition to see which household could be the best prepared for winter's theatrical flair. People didn't just store enough food, they stored for a season that might well forget to ever end. Because when your entire weather forecast is snow, sleet, and internal screams, the notion of over-prepared becomes charmingly irrelevant. Let us imagine, if you will, a settler named Tobias Gale, a man with the posture of a regretful pine tree and a beard that had already caught 2 sparrows without meaning to. Tobias was not necessarily a man of wit, but he was emphatically a man of storage. Inside his home, every inch was a testament to potential scarcity. Dried apples dangled like garlands from the ceiling beams. Cured meats hung in solemn rows like smoky chandeliers. Shelves bulged with jars of preserves, which collectively contained more sugar than the average royal wedding cake. Tobias's strategy was simple. If it could be salted, he salted it. If it couldn't, he tried anyway. His brother-in-law once made the mistake of falling asleep near the pickling barrels. For 3 days, The family fed him exclusively vinegar and cucumbers until he found his voice again. Now, warmth was the second obsession next to food, and firewood was less a resource and more a neighborly currency. A tall stack by your doorway meant two things. You'd survive February, and everyone in the village would stare at you with a mixture of awe and thinly veiled envy. Most families spent weeks chopping logs, splitting kindling, and muttering affectionately at their axes like old friends. The sound of a well-struck log echoing through frozen trees was considered the lullaby of the north. A good stack was layered like fine bedding, dense at the core, airy along the edges, lightly kissed by snowflakes that would melt out of sheer respect for the effort. Of course, the reality of heating a drafty one-room cabin meant that sides of your face could exist in different climates. One cheek would roast beside the fireplace, while the other flirted dangerously with frostbite. Children became experts at rotating like rotisserie chickens. No one wanted to be the frozen end of the bunk bed. Clothing became both function and fashion. Layers upon layers were proudly donned, sometimes resulting in young ones falling over like ambitious root vegetables. Mitten technology had come far, or at least far enough to guarantee you could keep your hand warm while utterly failing to grasp anything. Tying boots became a two-person job. Changing shirts was an afternoon ordeal. Lavatories, well, let's just say that the outhouse in December was a spiritual experience. Many settlers developed the practical habit of leaving poems etched into the wooden walls of these icy confessionals, long rhyming farewells to bodily warmth and polite pleas for spring. One such poem, by an anonymous genius only known as Cold Eliza, read, "When cheeks do freeze and hope runs out, I dream of August, scream not shout. To sit upon this throne of pine is less of duty, more of shrine. But amid all this preparation, the preserving, the chopping, the layering, what truly endured was the quiet sense of togetherness. Come evening, after snow had muffled the world and lamplight danced across the walls, families gathered round the fire like cats near a sunbeam. They stitched and sang and told stories older than memories, their voices floating through the chilled air like the scent of cinnamon and pine smoke. And as the snow deepened outside, the settlers, wrapped in comfort and salted meats, turned their thoughts to the season's next great challenge, cleverly hiding the good biscuits before the in-laws arrived. There was still more to prepare, of course. One could stock pantries and stack logs, but what of the heart? What of the soul's need for a little mischief and mirth? That, dear listener, would soon find its place too. When the darkness of December crept over the thatched roofs of early colonial homes, and the wind howled through half-sealed windows like a ghost complaining about property taxes, the settlers knew one thing above all else. If winter didn't break their spirits, it might at least give their toes frostbite. But not if they prepared properly, and prepared they did. Sometimes with wisdom, sometimes with panic, and occasionally with folk wisdom that, in retrospect, sounds like it was invented by someone already halfway, delirious with a cold. Food preservation was no joke when the next shipment of supplies was stuck months away, likely on a boat that had sprung a mysterious leak or angered the Atlantic. So they salted everything. Pork, salted. Fish, salted. Beans. Salt them so aggressively they questioned their own legume identity. Early settlers practically lived inside a salt barrel if it meant the ham would make it to February. Cellars were their treasure caves. Dark, cool, slightly suspicious-smelling rooms where barrels of salted meats, fermenting vegetables, and root stacks stood like quiet sentinels against starvation. cabbage was king. Those stoic, leafy heads were layered into stone crocks, kissed with salt, weighed down by stones, and left to sour deliciously into sauerkraut. A German miracle, that one. The settlers didn't just import seeds and guns. Oh no, they imported sauerkraut. And thank goodness they did. Without that tart bite of vitamin C, entire villages might have scurried into the jaws of scurvy without a fight. Then came the cheeses, wheels of cheddar, Gouda, and experimental dairy bricks of unknown heritage, all aging gently, nestled in cloth and dreams. Some were buried in cold rooms, others hung like sacred punctuation from damp rafters. This wasn't just food, it was a plan, a defense system, a culinary trust fund from their summer selves to see them through until the thaw. Clothes followed a similar strategy. Make them thick, make them itchy, and layer them until your movement resembled a resigned penguin. Wool ruled supreme. Fasting through the sweat-prickled summer months, settlers sheared their sheep with the precision of surgeons and then spun the wool by firelight, thread by thread, until they had enough itchy armor to face even the bitterest blizzard. Naturally, mittens emerged not so much as fashion, but as miniature survival pods for each hand. Homemade, misshapen, and occasionally adorned with a decorative knot or other practical confusion. Some mittens had strings connecting them so children couldn't lose them, and some suspected this was also to retrieve the child if needed. Their boots were boots, sturdy if not always water-resistant. Settlers experimented with stuffing them, straw, moss, newspaper, and in desperate cases, clean rags of whatever fabric hadn't yet been turned into mittens. And of course, there was the widespread belief that a generous layer of bacon fat on your feet would keep the cold out, your skin soft, and every dog in the Tri-County area deeply interested in your ankles. Homes, meanwhile, were treated like fortresses in constant defense against both the cold and sheer boredom. In the absence of proper insulation, families hung quilts on their walls, plugged gaps between logs with moss or animal hair, or whatever fuzzy material happened to wander too close, and banked their fires into glowing coals under layers of ash each night, praying it still smouldered come morning. That fire, small, central, stubborn, was more than heat. It was the heartbeat of the home. From it came stew, warmth, light, and of course, the daily game of who stands closest while pretending not to hog it. A colonial favorite. And still, despite their best efforts, early mentions in settler diaries speak of cold so deep it creaked the bones of their houses. Whole days whitened by relentless snowfall. Weeks where children played only in corridors between stacked firewood, and the air inside the homes held a crispness that even hot stew struggled to melt. But huddled together, wrapped in layers of intention and wool, they sang, or mumbled, or made tiny folk instruments from hollow reeds and stubborn hope. Some families passed evenings telling stories so wild they might have melted the frost with sheer narrative heat. Tales of beasts in the woods, of distant lands warmer than their dreams, of a spring that would eventually, surely, return. And just as the soup cooled and the fire yawned into embers, someone would glance nervously at the roof, listening for the creak of snow shifting dangerously above, as they drifted into a sleep stitched tight with layers of salted pork and slowly fermenting cabbage. Much lay ahead, deeper snows, stranger remedies, and the curious case of the bare fat candle that just would not go out. But those stories twinkled faintly on the edge of the next cold morning. Far beneath the brittle grey skies of a colonial December, where the wind whistled through leafless trees with the size of 1,000 shivering hats, The settlers had a peculiar tradition, calculating just how much firewood they wouldn't have enough of. You see, for early settlers, winter was less a season and more of a full-time test of existential improvisation. Would the turnips last? Would the well freeze shut? Would Jonathan's attempt at wool sock making yield warmth or foot confinement reminiscent of medieval punishment devices? But long before the blizzards arrived in their snowy opera cloaks, before ice clung like glass earrings to the eaves, the preparation began, with curious, quiet rituals and a sprinkle of questionable accounting. If a settler family estimated they'd need 4 cords of wood for the winter, the seasoned ones, those who had survived at least one frost-inspired spiritual awakening, knew to aim for at least 8, because firewood, rather rudely, has a habit of getting used up by January, and storing it was its own game. Wood could not simply be thrown into a pile like a disappointed stack of failed ideas. No, it had to be arranged with the architectural elegance of a Norwegian wedding cake, neatly stacked, bark side up, somewhere dry, and ideally, far enough from the house to avoid being used as a last-minute sled ramp by the children, but close enough to grab during an unexpected sleet attack. Inside, homes became miniature fortresses against both the outside elements and the inside proclivities of everyday entropy. Bedding was fluffed beyond its natural limits. Curtains were sewn with whatever fabric hadn't already been turned into clothing, and windows were sealed with strips of paper dipped in lard, wax, or sheer manifest hope. If you ever wonder why your modern rental comes with drafty windows, just know you're upholding a noble tradition several centuries strong. But perhaps one of the most enchanting and slightly baffling parts of preparing for the endless winter was the art of food preservation. The settlers, lacking refrigerators, chemical preservatives, or a strong belief in expiration dates, turned to root cellars and smokehouses like culinary magicians pulling ham from hats. They salted meats with the same reverence one might today reserve for heirloom sourdough. Vegetables, far too innocent-looking to survive the frozen months alone, were stored in barrel-like catacombs filled with layers of straw and sand, like precious relics destined to become stew. And then there was the butter. Ah, butter. In winter, it was less of an ingredient and more of an emotional anchor. Churned into dense golden bricks, it was stored cool and wrapped like treasure, gleaming like the sun you wouldn't see again until May. For children, it was a delicious miracle. For adults, it was calorie insurance. Entertainment, too, required planning. With the outdoor world sealed in snowdrifts and ice enough to pickle a fox, families dug into their reserves of storytelling, amateur music, and arguing about how deep the snow used to be. Knitting became both sport and salvation. Carving small objects out of wood, spoons, dolls, unsettlingly cheerful figurines, provided a quiet sort of joy and a way to keep fingers busy so they wouldn't freeze stiff. Now, of all the overlooked marvels of winter preparation, perhaps none were so vital and so hilariously underestimated as candle making. Light was precious and fickle. When your entire home is lit by the glow of a single bee-scented taper made from months of saved-up tallow, the importance of strategic candle usage cannot be overstated. Families often saved their best candles, the ones that didn't sputter or smell suspiciously poultry-adjacent, for special occasions like holidays, births, and reading letters from home in a slightly dramatic tone. And as the frost began to creep, like some frozen vine across the window's glass, the family would settle into the warmth of each other. Huddled close around the hearth, wrapped in patchwork layers of wool and laughter, They rode out the season like cozy ships in a storm. For settlers, winter was never about comfort. It was about triumph. The joy of surviving one more snowstorm, one more night without fire going out, one more bowl of stew that hadn't frozen before you finished eating it. And as the cold swirled outside, they would finish their evening rituals, quiet prayers, a final stoke of the fire, the careful banking of embers, and perhaps a smile shared over the memory of last winter's catastrophic jam explosion, before gently slipping off to sleep. And just beyond that flickering hearthlight, plans were already brewing, not of survival, but of sweetness and story, for winter's chill had a curious way of soaking into dreams, which, as we drift gently now, brings us to something far more delicious than salted pork. In the growing hush of late autumn, there came a moment every settler began to eye their chimney with reverence. A true relationship was forged with the hearth, part survival strategy, part spiritual commitment, and part social status, because nothing said respectable homestead quite like a consistently smoking flue. You must understand that firewood, back then, was not so much a resource as it was a religion. Preparing wood for a long, undetermined winter was one of those sacred duties that could make or break a family. It also provided endless opportunities for unsolicited advice from elderly neighbors. Split the wood before November, or the cold will split it for you. Old Josiah might mumble through his beard, which conveniently functioned as both scarf and crumb catcher. Of course, Josiah had also spent the better part of 26 years trying to invent a self-chopping log, so he wasn't taken too seriously. Still, everyone agreed on one doctrine. One could never have too much firewood, for fuel wasn't just for warmth. It was how you cooked your stew, dried your socks, and had dramatic philosophical debates with your spouse while staring into the flickering embers and contemplating whether a squirrel might be considered meat or simply ambiguous protein content. Felling trees in those days was practically a lifestyle. Settlers would mark their chosen trees in late summer, typically the sturdy oaks and maples, although every now and then some bold soul would attempt to split elm and immediately regret every life choice that led up to that moment. By October, the forest filled with the rhythmic, almost meditative sound of axes thumping wood. It wasn't just labor, it was winter rehearsal, a kind of choreography between settler and splintering trunk. Thunk, pause, grunt, thunk, sneeze. If you listen closely, you could hear entire symphonies of early winter prep being scored one log at a time. And then came stacking. If you ever need to assess someone's state of mind, observe the way they stack wood. Precise crosshatch style, probably German. Wild, chaotic heaps, almost certainly Irish, or possibly someone who read one too many Back to the Land pamphlets and was just winging it. Some believed stacking wood facing north would keep it drier. Others, that stacking in a circle warded off foxes from urinating on it. Both beliefs were dubious, yet firmly held. Children, meanwhile, were roped in to help under the guise of family bonding, which was settler code for free labor. They'd carry kindling in little baskets, sometimes proudly, sometimes rebelliously dragging every stick, and muttering about how unfair it was that goats never had to help. The goats, for the record, mostly just looked smug. And then, yes, there was cord measurement, the bane of every honest woodcutter's existence. You see, a cord of wood was supposed to be 128 cubic feet, which sounds reassuringly precise, until you try to fit a non-compliant branchy log into a measurement system that never accounted for knots, bark, or irregularly enthusiastic chopping. Arguments would break out over logging disputes, some of which escalated into what historians now refer to as awkward glowering, followed by overly polite invitations to dinner. Because even in disagreement, civility was critical when your neighbours were the only people within shouting distance all winter. By late November, woodpiles became quiet monuments to human ambition, looking vaguely like modern art, installations with a smoky fragrance. Families, done with the main supply, began building secondary stacks and even emergency stacks, which were usually positioned somewhere inconvenient, like halfway up a hill or inside the chicken coop, just in case. Each year brought new whispers, stories of the family downriver who ran out of firewood by January and had to burn their furniture. Urban myths emerged around desperate households toasting their boots or using straw from the mattress. These tales, whether true or fantastical, served as moral warnings wrapped in ash-scented paranoia. In truth, firewood was never just about the cold. It was about assurance, about saying, yes, the snow may fall for 3 lifetimes, but by heaven, we'll roast this rutabaga in comfort. It was, in some wistful way, the earliest insurance policy settlers could build with their bare hands and aching backs. As the hearths were lit on that first icy morning, a strange sense of peace settled in. There was a comfort in the crackle, a rhythm in the warmth, and a quiet pride to sitting, all bundled in wool, beside a stack of wood tall enough to double as a wall against doubt. And it was in that glow, as steam curled from kettles and muffled voices prepared for evening stew, that thoughts turned inevitably to the next great challenge, food storage, and the curious misadventures of sealing everything in jars. Inside the snug log cabins of the early North American settlers, where windows were more fog than glass, and the scent of dried herbs mingled with smoke from the hearth, winter wasn't just a season. It was an adversary, a slow, silent siege that could last 6 months, 7 if the groundhog got spooked. And so, the families who braved this chilly frontier developed a skill more prized than swordplay or bear wrestling: preparation. By the 12th week of autumn, the world outside had begun to vanish beneath a steadily thickening layer of snow, while inside, life turned into one long wool-covered waiting game. This was the time when the firewood stack had to look less like a pile and more like architecture. At least one wall of the cabin was overtaken by logs, split and stacked so neatly that some settlers joked they'd rather admire them than burn them. This was, of course, before late February came around, and they ended up burning half the furniture and a wooden spoon named Gerald. Food preservation had become a kind of frontier alchemy. Root vegetables were tucked cozily under layers of sawdust like they were guests at a particularly rustic spa. Apples were stored in barrels packed with straw, which, depending on your optimism level, either preserved them beautifully or turned them into softly fermenting apple surprises by early spring. Salt pork and smoked sausages dangled from ceilings like delicious wind chimes. Even the mice, despite their best efforts at stealth, must have felt deeply honored to be surrounded by such culinary artistry. One particularly prized technique was the cold cellar. Now, this sounds like an overwrought Halloween decoration, but in reality, it was a hole in the ground, sometimes dug under the house, other times burrowed into a hillside, lined with stones and insulated with straw, moss, or whatever nature had coughed up nearby. Into this chilled pantry went anything that you might want slightly less frozen than the outside world. Cheese, stacks of butter wrapped in muslin, homemade pickles that could outlast a treaty. It all went into the ground, like some kind of edible time capsule. Winter clothing was another form of preparation, though fashionable might be the last word you'd ever use to describe it. Layers were the strategy. Wool under linen under more wool, with an extra shawl for good measure and mittens that could double as sleeping bags. Kids were bundled so tightly before going outside that they could only move if tipped forward and allowed to roll. And yet, despite all the sobering necessity, there was something oddly festive about the pre-winter scramble, as if the entire settlement were involved in gearing up for a slightly dangerous, deeply inconvenient holiday. Candles were dipped, their wicks carefully braided from leftover spun flax. Quilts were patched one final time before being layered 4 deep on straw mattresses. Even the pigs got an extra serving of scraps, mostly to fatten them before their inevitable role in something called hog butchering season, held around November, with much fanfare and an unreasonable quantity of hams. Inside, as snow began to clap gently against the wooden shutters and the hearth cracked like a polite thunderstorm, people settled into rhythms shaped by necessity and a certain stubborn cheer. There were long evenings of storytelling where grandfathers described winters so cold the chickens wore hats, probably not true, and grandmothers knitted scarves long enough to lasso a snow drift. Children invented indoor games like Don't Spill the Candle and Whisper Until Someone Laughs, which frankly is still a top-tier party game. And always there was the watching of the weather. This too was an occupation. Old-timers would lick fingers and hold them to the wind, or peer at the clouds with all the overconfidence of a man with sore knees and no meteorological training. If the moon had a ring around it, or if the cattle were especially moody, it meant more snow was on the way. That, or the cows had simply grown tired of being stared at. Still, through all of it, the stacking, the salting, the storytelling, there was an unshakable belief that spring would come again. Eventually, maybe, after many more games of Whisper Until Someone Laughs. And somewhere deep beneath the snows, under quilts and dreams and a roof braced with prayer and pine tar, they waited. As outside, another snowflake arrived, like the soft note of a lullaby still being written, waiting now only for a tale of fire, frost, and one particularly opinionated wool sock. As the first snow curled from the sky like lazy cigar smoke, the settlers turned their worried eyes toward the smallest but most contentious part of winter preparation. Candles. Yes, candles. Those flickering beacons of warmth and sanity. Those tiny torches against the darkness that fell like a stage curtain at 4 in the afternoon, when the sun retired early and without so much as a goodbye wave. Candles became the unofficial currency of winter. They lit the hearthside chess games, the endless mending piles, the solemn Bible readings, and, for the more dramatic among them, the occasional spontaneous poetry recital involving geese. But candles didn't grow on trees, unless you were talking about tallow, and technically, neither trees nor tallow grew, but were more, processed. Now, contrary to romantic depictions, colonial candles did not spill golden light over pristine wood floors, while Martha stirred mulled cider like a rustic goddess. No, candle making was a smelly, sticky, outright chaotic exercise in early settler alchemy. First came the tallow. Rendered down from beef or mutton fat, this process began with a cauldron, some sweet, and a readiness to embrace the sort of aroma typically found 2 doors down from a troll's summer cottage. The boiling fat hissed and popped like it had personal grievances. Families took turns stirring slowly, faces resolute, noses slightly traumatized. For those who couldn't stomach the stench, or who preferred a candle that didn't make the parlor smell like last Tuesday's stew, there was beeswax. But beeswax was finicky, precious, not unlike gold, if gold came pre-installed with a workforce of defensive insects. To get beeswax, one had to either befriend a beekeeper or be brave enough to harvest a hive oneself, preferably without becoming the community's most swollen anecdote. Once the wax, whether bovine, lane-hopping sheep, or disgruntled bee, was procured, it was time to make the wicks. Wicks were fashioned from cotton or linen thread and repeatedly dipped into the molten fat or wax. Dip, cool, dip again. Over and over until the humble string grew into a candle, the way stalactites slowly form or children sneak snacks into bed. This was called hand dipping, a process carried out with all the meditative rhythm of monks chanting. If the monks were elbow deep in fat and working next to chickens, some enterprising souls invented candle molds to speed things up. These were tin tubes into which hot wax was poured around pre-threaded wicks. This reduced dripping and improved uniformity, because nothing says civilized winter like symmetrical illumination. Whichever method they used, once the candles were made, they had to be stored carefully. Too close to the hearth and they melted. Too far from it and mice got suspiciously interested. And no one wanted rodents getting bright ideas. And I do mean that literally. So candles were counted and rationed like treasure. There were work candles for chores, company candles for impressing vaguely judgmental neighbors, and the don't touch these or so help me candles hidden from children who believed burning four at once made for a better ghost story. And yes, before there were bedtime screen addictions and LED nightlights shaped like clouds, there were bedtime candles. Dim, noble things set beside the straw-stuffed mattress, offering soft, golden glows and highly encouraged fire hazards. Stories were read by their light, idle thoughts scribbled in journals said to be for posterity, but mostly filled with things like very cold again, saw raccoon, possibly possessed. The candle also served as the unspoken signal of bedtime itself. Once the final flame flickered out, there was little point in staying awake unless you were conducting an emotionally complex conversation with the fireplace. But beyond light, candles gave a kind of morale. They were handcrafted hope, a glowing promise that even in the darkest stretch of the year some small warmth persisted. A light you could carry room to room like it was verifying that everything, indeed, still existed. There's something undeniably comforting about imagining a family of settlers huddled close on a long winter night, soft candlelight dancing over hand-stitched quilts and well-worn tales. Perhaps a grandfather is telling a wildly inaccurate folk legend, thick with bears the size of cottages and snow that whispers secrets in Gaelic. The fire crackles. A child nods off, with a half-finished lump of embroidery in her lap. And outside, the wind rearranges drifts like it's decorating. Not every survival tale ends with heroics and dramatic clashes with wolves. Sometimes, victory means having just enough candles and the wherewithal not to burn the house down with them. And just as those settlers dipped their wicks with care and foresight, so too did they plan their pantries. Because once the lights were made, it was on to the matter of meals. Particularly what mock apple pie and pickled mystery awaited the stingy embrace of January. Outside, the frost crept across every surface like a slow-moving army of silver beetles. It invaded boots, nibbled fingertips, and painted windows with surprisingly artistic spirals. Inside, the settlers, those weary, wool-clad optimists, were engaged in one of their most sacred winter rituals, the making of comfort food with whatever hadn't already frozen solid, been gnawed by oxen, or mysteriously vanished into the cellar for medicinal purposes. Let's not confuse this with modern-day comfort food, of course. There was no sourdough starter lovingly named Gerald, and no Instagram-friendly flatbread sprinkled with despair and rosemary. No, this was survival comfort food, a hearty stew where the word hearty really just meant accompanied by sadness but technically edible. The cook of the house, often the person with the most remaining teeth and the fewest injuries from falling logs, would take their post over the hearth. These early kitchens were barely more than smoky corners with dangling herbs and a perennially confused chicken hovering suspiciously close to the fire. Tools included a cast iron pot that could double as a helmet in a siege, and a ladle heavy enough to discourage mid-winter optimism. The stew was built on a foundation of root vegetables so old they seemed to have grown personalities. You'd hear things like, "Hand me that sullen turnip," or "This carrot looks judgmental, but it'll do." Into the pot went a medley of what was left: aging onions, flaking wedges of preserved meat, dried beans with names like Soldier or Jacob's Cattle, which sounded biblical but tasted mostly like damp wisdom. Spices, sadly, were in short supply. The family might have had a precious tin of nutmeg, used only for festivals and arbitrarily deciding what counted as a festival. Pepper, if present, was considered wealthier than the baby's godfather. Instead, they leaned on garlic, mustard seed, and insultingly large quantities of salt to flirt with flavor. Yet, despite the culinary challenges, meal times were bright spots in the long winter blur. People gathered close, grateful for warmth, however smoky, and nourishment, however emotionally complex. Conversations turned to storytelling, because books were rare and radio had not yet been invented, despite persistent rumors spread by one particularly speculative badger hunter. Stories were rooted in every spoonful. How this rutabaga had been wrestled from frozen ground by cousin Edwin, shirtless and shouting about Viking ancestors. How the salt pork had been cured months ago, before the barrel cracked open during that unfortunate cart accident involving a very stubborn horse named Buttons. Every meal both fed and connected them. A literal stew of community mixed with a dash of, well, it's chewable. Now, we shouldn't over-romanticize it. There were no artisan cheese boards appearing with violin music, and no one said things like mouthfeel without biting their tongue in apology. But these humble meals, imperfect, humble, and sometimes mysterious in origin, were bonds. Contracts signed with ladles and sealed with groggy laughter. With the stew finally settled in their bellies, came the post-dinner ritual of drowsing by hearth. This was somewhere between intentional napping and vaguely waking meditation. Men leaned back in hand-hewn chairs that creaked like ancient ships. Women gathered their knitting or mending, half the time mending the knitting. Children sprawled like sleepy raccoons, clutching dolls sewn from leftover flour sacks and hay. A limited edition line called Despair Babies. A snowstorm might rage outside, but inside, tucked among blankets, firelight, and the subtle ambience of Uncle Wilhelm snoring like a deflating bellows, there was peace. Time slowed. The hours lost their urgency. The future, wrapped in uncertainty and foot-long icicles, could wait. Tonight offered stories, warmth, and stew that had almost no bark left in it. Every now and then someone would rise, stir the coals, add a log, or glance out the frost-glazed window. They might speak a word or two about the weather, or a dream involving a talking goat who ran a bakery. Whatever was said, it was accepted as normal. In winters this long, dreams began to bargain with reality. Soon, the last candle sputtered, the shadows thickened, and even the skeptical chicken gave up its silent vigil. Beyond the hearth, another crucial element of surviving the endless winter awaited: the beds. Not merely a place to sleep, but careful contraptions layered in quilts, pelts, and enough wool to suffocate a small bear. And if you happen to dream of gardens green, with spring or a stew prepared with actual pepper, well, that was just winter's way of reminding you it would not last forever. But the bed, yes, the bed. That's where we're heading next. Long before cozy snow globes and supermarket eggnog, winter descended on early settler communities like an uninvited guest who planned to sleep on the hearth indefinitely. And while today we grumble artfully about de-icing the car or finding mismatched gloves, the settlers had different concerns, like survival, or how to keep their toes, or whether their sheep had wandered off to start a new life. As late autumn whispered its final golden notes, the rhythm of life shifted once more. Preparations took on a fevered urgency, not unlike squirrels auditioning for a winter ballet, except the settlers had fewer nuts and far more anxiety. Everything had to be in its proper place before the snow rolled in like a cold, puffy tyrant. Food preservation was the great obsession, and rightly so. Without it, winter dinner parties would feature a single pickled beet and a solemn silence. Every root cellar was a treasure trove of turnips, onions, potatoes, cabbage. Nature's slow jazz ensemble. These bulky vegetables, bless them, stored fairly well in the cool, dark underground. But it wasn't just food that needed preserving. It was spirits, morale, and sometimes marriages. For meats, salting and smoking were essential arts. Hams hung from beams like meaty ornaments, while strips of venison or pork cured slowly in smokehouses built behind the main residence. Small wooden sheds that smelled gloriously like barbecue and hard work. Imagine walking past one and catching that scent in the air. Fragrant assurance that January wouldn't be entirely bean-based. Butter was churned in staggering amounts and tucked away in casks, kept cool in spring houses. Small stone or wooden structures built over flowing water, where milk, cheese, and butter could chill out, quite literally. These spring houses looked deceivingly quaint, but in truth, they were early refrigerators, operated by the grace of chilly groundwater and unwavering hope. Then there were the desperate dreams of fruit. Without apples or berries, dessert became a vague memory. So enter the apple drying racks, wide wooden frames stretched with cheesecloth, positioned in sunlit spots by day and covered at night. Imagine rows of thin apple slices patiently tanning, like silent actors waiting for their chance to be baked into a January pie. Clothing also had to level up. Linen and cotton were fine for the flirtatious breezes of June, but winter demanded wool. Layers upon woolly layers, itchy, scratchy, soul-hugging warmth. The rhythm of spinning wheels never stopped, nor did the clicking and clattering of knitting needles. Stockings were knit for every conceivable limb. Mittens were made not just in pairs, but in pessimistic dozens because one glove inevitably vanished on the third snowfall under mysterious mitten gnome circumstances. And let's not forget the windows. Today, when winter arrives, we might turn up the thermostat and brush some frosty poetry off the glass. But then, windows were stuffed with rags, paper, and hope. Wealthier settlers affixed oiled parchment or mica slivers to their window frames, allowing some light through while fending off the draft. It was like inviting winter to peek in. but politely asking it not to stay for tea. Water, that humble cornerstone of life and soup, had to be managed carefully. Wells would freeze, buckets would crack, and by February, fetching water involved conversations like, should we sacrifice the ice pick to the pond gods today, or just lick snowflakes and hope for the best? Rain barrels were drained and upturned. Snow, when clean enough, became the temporary tap, melted over wood stoves for everything from tea to bath water. Though baths were scheduled with the enthusiastic frequency of taxes, candles were stockpiled by the dozens, simmered into being from animal fat and beeswax. Each candle represented an hour of light, and when you only have 10 usable hours of daylight, you learn to treat wax the way we treat Wi-Fi. Almost sacred, slightly irritating, and absolutely necessary. But beyond all the practicalities of brining and bundling and butter churning was something softer still. The belief that winter, however wild, was not a beast to defeat, but a guest to outlast. The lofts were padded thick with straw and quilts. Storytelling became the official pastime, alongside quiet games played by firelight and the gentle drama of communal silence. People didn't just prepare their homes, they readied their minds. This was the season of waiting, of listening to the wind and thinking slow thoughts. Now, with snowflakes already flirting at the edges of their fields, settlers turned inward, to hearths, to books if they had them, and to the warmth of shared resolve. And as the first snow settled like white lace over the rooftops, a quiet sense prevailed that they'd done what they could. The rest would be up to nature, luck, and the stubborn cheerfulness of people who'd stared down blizzards before. And so the landscape turned still and white, shutters gently trembling in the wind, while inside the cabins, stories began to rise like steam from wood-fired kettles, softly, slowly, and just in time for a long winter's peace. As the frost began to decorate every wooden beam and livestock whisker in sight, early settlers turned toward an art as old as civilization itself: preservation. Now, to us, that word might conjure images of vacuum-sealed cheese or suspiciously eternal pickles in grocery store aisles. But to a settler facing down the gnarled jaws of an endless winter, preservation was a kind of culinary sorcery, with a little desperation stirred in. You see, winter had a habit of sticking around in those days. Not the polite, 3-month variety shuffled between gentle autumns and sunnier springs, but the kind that sat down in your cabin, asked for soup, and wouldn't leave until your last pair of wool socks had been turned into mittens. So, out came the salt. Bushels of it. If it wasn't nailed down or milking something, it was getting salted. Pork, beef, fish. Entire herds of once roaming animals met their powdery brine fate. Pork barrels became sacred relics, tucked into root cellars with such reverence that one might expect them to also fight off scurvy and lonely thoughts. Without freezers, your average settler faced the question: how, in the name of oxen and oats, do I keep this stuff edible? So the answer was layers, layers of grease, layers of salt, and occasionally, if you lived near a river and had access to more than gut instinct, layers of ice. Ice houses were constructed, a sort of DIY refrigeration unit involving sawdust-packed pits and actual chunks of winter hoarded like treasure. Smoked meats, too, joined the winter resistance, a dedicated genre of cuisine born from hanging things over fires and saying a few hopeful prayers. Smokehouses dotted settlements, humble huts exhaling rich streams of wood smoke, vaguely curing both bacon and melancholy at the same time. But preservation wasn't just Meat's dramatic one-man play. There came jars, glass ones, earthenware ones, sometimes whatever a bored settler decided could probably hold a jam. Fruits and vegetables were stewed, sweated, boiled, poked and placed lovingly into pickling juice. And if you've never had a pickled turnip while snow seeps through your boots, well, perhaps that's for the best. But back then, it was luxury. Tangy, crunchy, frost-kissed luxury. With each jar sealed and shelf-stocked, the pantry transformed from mere closet to treasure vault. Shelves lined with crimson beets, murky dill cucumbers, and apples dried into wrinkled little snacks, made for months of slow chewing and slower conversation. Every bite was a memory of summer, preserved beneath vinegar and hope. Even breads had their role in winter survival. Day-old loaves became week-old loaves, became relationship-threatening hardtack. This delightful slab of flour, water, and jaw regret could, theoretically, last forever. If it's soft, it's spoiled, they'd say, probably while using it as a doorstop or makeshift roofing tile. Sometimes settlers even brewed a little something for comfort. Or let's be honest, mild intoxicated distraction. Hard cider, wild grape wine, and root-based tonics were more than party favors. They were medicinal excuses with a side of cheer. Grandma's cough remedy and Uncle Thomas's weather radar often came from the same bottle. And for all this preparation, still, winter threw its weight around. Fermented cabbage could freeze solid overnight. Pork barrels cracked like tired knees. And occasionally, even the dog looked longingly at a smoked ham hanging too high on the rafter. But these small failures couldn't shake the deep-set pride of having outwitted nature with brine and burnt wood. In the flickering candle glow of December evenings, families gathered near hearths, passing around preserved pears and telling stories of the Great Potato Surprise incident, which, spoiler alert, was not a happy surprise. The food was more than sustenance. It was memory. It was resilience. It was the stubborn yell of, "We're still here, snow or no snow." Outside, winter howled like a bored bard, but inside, the jars gleamed like stained glass windows. The air smelled of cedar and last week's soup, and on shelves built from old wagon wood and mild optimism, the secrets of survival sat quietly, waiting their turn. And just beyond that salt-encrusted door, a new worry was beginning to form. What happens when spring refuses to return on time? Again, as the frozen wind began to nibble impatiently at door hinges and chimney flues, the settlers knew it was time to prepare. Not just for winter, but for a winter. The type where snow drifts turn into structural features and livestock are seen less as animals and more as small, precious sources of central heating. Every step outside becomes an expedition. Every returning neighbor, a frostbitten war hero. But before we get to tales of windswept porches and ice crystals forming between church pews, we must first lower our lamplight down into the cozy world of the settlers' winter smithing, an entirely unofficial term I've just coined for their cold weather ingenuity. Long before thermostats and fleece lined everything, early settlers relied on layers, both physical and existential. Physically, they wore so many garments you could mistake a single man for a laundry line in a windstorm. Wool, of course, was gold. If you had a sheep, you had warmth. If you had many sheep, you had warmth and neighbors eyeing your fences very, very closely. And, lest we forget, mittens. Mittens, you see, were not just handwear. They were symbols of desperation turned into dexterity. Some families had what were lovingly called communal mittens. the one or two decent pairs that were passed around depending on who was going outside. A poorly timed trip to the outhouse could mean discovering that the mittens are already out with Ma, leaving your fingers to negotiate with Frost over who got to keep the thumbs. Inside the homes, cleverness reigned. Early colonial kitchens became makeshift war rooms against the cold, and the bread oven. That was your first line of defense. After the day's baking, families often tucked in around the cooling masonry, soaking up the lingering heat like cats with legal rights. In some traditions, they would even slide stoneware jugs of boiled water beneath their feather beds, a charming precursor to the modern hot water bottle, except far more susceptible to steam-based betrayal. Featherbeds, of course, were the mattress of the gods, if one was lucky enough to have ducks that had been tipsy from generosity. Stuffed to near bursting with down and sewn shut with the hope of continuity, featherbeds were treasured and ferociously defended. Woe betide the person who jumped onto one and flattened the fluff. They would be exiled to the undesirable lean-to known only as the winter annex, essentially 4 walls, a sagging cot, and an eternal draught. As for food, well, the pantry in December was a gallery of jars, skeins, and preserved hopes, salted pork, pickled everything, root vegetables crouching in crates like sleepy gnomes, apples stored in barrels of sawdust to postpone their inevitable mellowing into cider candidates. Every item had been carefully prepared back in September, when spirits were still buoyed by sunshine and the slightly deranged optimism that this year maybe the roof wouldn't leak. And if that roof did leak, well, that's when you discovered whether the keep calm and carry on philosophy had any practical application when your tea was diluted by melting snow from the rafters. Of course, survival wasn't just strategy, it was community theatre. Settlers embraced the season with tales told by firelight, fiddles brought out for warm-footed dances, and competitions to see who could knit a sock long enough to stretch down the chimney and still reach the mantel. Letters from distant relatives became treasured missives, often arriving months late, having been transported by sleigh, ferry, sled dog, and probably the occasional very determined goose. Still, these letters brought news, affection, and recipes, often all in the same barely decipherable scroll. And through it all, there was a roughshod serenity to winter's rain. Life slowed under snow's hush. Chores became less chore-like when performed in 2s, 3s, or in whispered revolts against the cold. And somehow, in cabins where the windows iced on the inside, people managed to laugh, to read aloud by candlelight, and to accept that the smell of boiled cabbage was just part of life now. As the wind moaned and pine trees creaked in their somber dance, the settlers huddled closer, under quilts, around fires, and within stories that would carry them through the long, white season. And just as the frost grew sharper in the corners of the window panes, so too did their thoughts turn to dreams, not of springtime, but of how, come next morning, they might build a new kind of warmth, one ember at a time, which, as it happens, begins in the most curious of places, someone's very peculiar idea of a thermal discovery involving mud, moss, and a deeply confused chicken. Long before roads were salted, thermostats clicked, or weather apps warned you about a wintry mix, early settlers prepared for winter the only way they knew how, like it might actually never end, because from their perspective, it just might not, especially when your nearest neighbors were 3 miles away, your insulation was moss, and your food preservation method involved salt, luck, and prayers to saints you only half remembered. As the winds hissed through the shutterless gaps of log cabins and the first snowflakes flirted with the thatched roofs above, there began a peculiar ritual of tightening, packing, stashing, and, perhaps most crucially, knitting. Wool took center stage. The settlers had long since discovered that sheep were more than just bleating lawnmowers. They were wearable if treated properly. Layer upon layer of hand-spun, slightly itchy, lovingly lumpy wool sweaters, mittens, caps, and beyond were piled high in chests. Each item somehow both too precious and too flawed to throw away. Stockpiling food was a drama unto itself. Root cellars, muddy, coal-smelling caves dug into the ground, acted as nature's refrigerators, only slightly mouldier. There, settlers stashed vast hordes of tubers, squash, cabbages, and onions, each nestled like sleepy children in straw or newspaper. The cellar had pride of place in the homestead lore, second only to Grandpa's tale about how he chased off a bear using nothing but a broom and some stern language. Preserving meat was a task not for the faint of nose. Large chunks of pork were salted to oblivion, then hung from rafters like particularly muscular ghosts. Bacon slabs and hams dangled beside sausage links, each one a ticker of survival, counting down the days till spring. Sometimes they smoked the meat, filling the air with the pious perfume of hickory and desperation. For every family, there was the famous soup, not a recipe so much as a process. No matter what, something was always bubbling on the hearth, some clattering crock of broth that, given enough imagination and the right root vegetables, could be considered a stew. It absorbed the leftovers, welcomed guest squash, and multiplied like folklore. A ladleful today might contain a carrot introduced in October and a bean from last Tuesday. It was less a dish and more a companion, a friendly slurry that warmed bellies and made iron pots feel useful. Meanwhile, the world outside transformed into a slow-falling poem of snow and silence. To modern eyes, it might look romantic. To the settlers, it was one part postcard, one part obstacle course. Tracks in the snow were studied like ancient runes. Was that a deer, a raccoon, or just the neighbor's overly curious cow again? Identifying wildlife prints became a guessing game and minor obsession. Some even fancied themselves amateur trackers, though most of their deductions concluded in the same way. Well, whatever it was, it got away. There was also the indoor migration. Hens, now too delicate for the cold, would occasionally earn a berth inside the cabin, clucking softly from a repurposed basket near the hearth. Worried, perhaps, but at least warm. If a settler's cat wasn't already sleeping somewhere suspiciously clean, it likely had been adopted by a neighbor further down the trail who hosted fewer children and a better brand of dried fish. Entertainment adjusted to the season. Long evenings led to longer stories. Myths expanded, jokes grew embellishments, and family legends were lovingly retold, each time with minor details shamelessly upgraded. Nobody minded. After all, if it's cold enough, no one argues with the man who claims he once outran a snowstorm on foot, especially if he's holding the stew ladle. And all the while, daylight waned so early one wondered if the sun had simply given up. Candles were trimmed, and the hearth fed like an honored relative. Another log, another flicker of light. Shadows danced along log walls, swaying like gentle spirits hypnotized by kindling. And woven between all these quiet, quirky preparations was something even deeper. A hush, thoughtful and enduring, like the whole world had curled up under a woolen quilt. The settlers, though grumbling and bundled, were tapped into a rhythm older than maps. Survive, yes, but maybe, just maybe, find room for a little wonder too. And so, as frozen branches encased the cabin windows in silvery lace and the soup reached that perfect midpoint between edible and mysterious, the settlers exhaled in comfortable truce with the season. There would be more shivering ahead, but maybe something else too. Something just beginning to stir, soft-footed and frost-dusted. But that quiet curiosity, well, that is a tale worth steeping in its own time. As winter crept closer with the slow and fussy gait of an old man in too many knitted scarves, the early settlers turned their attention to what might be the most perilous enemy of all: idleness. Yes, they feared wolves, and yes, they feared starvation. But beneath layers of wool and salted meats, another threat loomed: the long winter lull. Months trapped in snow-blanketed cabins meant not only surviving the cold, but surviving each other. Let us not forget, this was an age before puzzles, before Netflix, before anything that could be reasonably folded into a hobby. For many a settler, leisure was an unsolved mystery, and boredom, a hostile entity. But fear not, they had a plan. Several, in fact. Some practical, some peculiar, and many as snugly strange as a mitten made for a chicken. For starters, they sang. Oh, the singing. Homegrown tunes crooned beside the fire were like audio quilts stitched with what little harmony could be wrangled around sore throats and washboards. These weren't ditties for entertainment alone, but for structure, for memory, for warmth. A good song knew the measurements of the chimney, the pattern of the stars, and in at least one recorded instance, how to churn butter while stomping out a foot tune about regrettable marriages. Then there were the games, though I use the term quite liberally. If you ever find yourself snowed in with limited options, consider the colonial classic Hot Thumb. The rules are baffling, but it appears to have involved hiding one's thumb in hot porridge, daring others to touch it with icicle fingers, and then pretending no one was mad. Needless to say, entertainment thresholds were different back then. Children, natural repositories of cabin-bound energy, were put to work, albeit gently. There were acorns to carve into beads, yarn dolls to braid and re-braid, until their hair resembled something from a fashion-forward ghost story, and of course, mock courtrooms, where small disputes like who watered the goat last were dramatized with surprising legal flair. One particularly serious goose-naming lawsuit lasted 3 snowstorms. And then there were stories. Oh, the stories. More than just tales for the hearth, these were survival mechanisms veiled in folklore clothing. Grandmothers, with mysterious twinkles in eyes long since adapted to candlelight, often told cautionary tales of snow giants who sniffed out lazy children, or frosty spirits who disapproved of poor posture. By narrative sleight of hand, children grew up believing good manners kept the cold at bay. It was only mildly manipulative, wholly effective. Meanwhile, the art of mending reached new heights, or at least excellent widths. One could judge a household's idleness by the sheer girth of its patched socks. Some grew larger with each winter, passed down through generations like hereditary mittens with personality disorders. A toe hole was not a flaw. It was an invitation for creativity, and perhaps a tiny stitched anecdote. Food preparation, too, took on ceremonial significance. Not all preserves were meant to be eaten quickly. Some were saved, admired, considered. There were dried apples so accordioned and elegant they became decoration. Pickled vegetables, aligned by hue and optimism, sat like gleaming trophies in the root cellar. And maple syrup, boiled down to a dark alchemy, was often whispered over like it contained secrets. Spoiler alert. It did. Mostly about pancakes. Letters were written, though very few were sent until the roads thawed. In the interim, they served as emotional venting mechanisms and dreams on paper. Some settlers developed deep, complex relationships with friends they would never mail. Their postal pen pals, if you will, stored in a carved wooden box under the bed. It was like social media. Only instead of likes, you got mold. And when things grew truly bleak, when the snow shrieked outside like it was trying to join a dinner party uninvited, the settlers turned to a final trusty friend, the almanac. Simple, unassuming, yet bursting with knowledge, riddles, weather predictions, farming advice, and moon gossip. Reading it by lantern light, settlers were not just informed, they were reassured. The future still had a schedule. The moon would be full again. Spring would come. With hands busied, minds softened, and imaginations stoked like the steady fire in the stone hearth, the long winter began to feel, perhaps, a little less eternal. And so, as frost gathered on the window panes like tired silver fingerprints, they settled deeper into the stories, the socks, the songs, and the shared glances that said, "We are here still, and that is something." Now, speaking of something, let's see what happens when the snow begins to whisper back. By the time December's breath laced the air with silver frost, the settlers had made peace with the fact that cleanliness, like the sun, would return in spring. Probably. But until then, winter meant hunkering down into an existence best described as fermented snugness. Baths were rare, drafts were plentiful, and someone somewhere always seemed to be boiling onions for seemingly no reason at all. Yet amidst the drafty doorways and the staggering scent of long underwear worn far too long, there emerged a surprising hero of the eternal winter, the humble hearth. Not just a fireplace, mind you, but the very lifeblood of the household, a warm, crackling lava pit of civilization in an otherwise frozen world. Here you'd find more than just a place to cook turnips and burn your elbows. No, this was domestic headquarters. Food preparation? Yes. Sock drying? Essential. Pottery experiments gone horribly wrong. All taken care of next to the hearth. Even storytelling. Lively tales whispered from chapped lips over the sound of bubbling stew pots. Now, the hearth was tended with almost religious devotion. Kindling was hoarded like ancient treasure. Ashes were cleared with something bordering on pageantry. Even the youngest children were entrusted with the sacred duty of not letting the embers die. Not because adults trusted them, but because if the fire went out, someone would have to go outside, into the snow, with a flint, in the wind, and no sane person wanted that job. To pass the time by the fire, settlers found themselves immersed in what modern humans might call lo-fi entertainment. There were knitting circles, which, in truth, looked a bit less like circles and a bit more like quiet huddles of woolly sages muttering about drop stitches. There were shadow puppets, less out of whimsy and more because actual puppets required resources that had long since been turned into mittens. Domestic music, too, flourished in its slightly out-of-tune glory. Fiddles squeaked, dulcimers thunked, and voices rose in harmony that could only be described as bravely spirited. Even a cowbell or two might join in from a hopeful cousin in the corner who claimed he had rhythm now. And all of it, the chords, the chat, the steaming porridge passed around in chipped bowls, took place in that golden radius around the hearth. The outer limits were marked by a fine line. Step too far and you'd freeze. Lean too close and you'd singe your eyebrows. It was in many ways the settlers' first classroom in thermodynamics. By mid-January, even conversation had adopted a slower, dreamlike pace. Gone were the brisk exchanges of fall, chop wood, mend roof, run from wolf. Instead, winter bred a kind of mental fermentation. Long tales stretched out like woolen scarves, yarns about Aunt Maud's haunted knee, or that time a moose crashed a wedding. No one was in a hurry to reach the end. The joy, after all, lived somewhere in the middle. Letters, when they could be written, not always sent, mind you, but written, were full of poetic pondering on the weather, the odd behavior of chickens, and the latest speculation about whether it would ever get warmer again. Spoiler: of course it would. But when you're measuring temperature in how long a potato can sit outside before turning into a snow globe, optimism wears a thick coat. Household chores became less about necessity and more about soft survival. If someone knelt to scrub the floor in midwinter, it wasn't because they liked clean floorboards. It was because body heat was precious, and furious scrubbing generated both calories burned and an illusion of productivity. And so, the rhythm hummed on. Morning porridge, afternoon wool mending, evening whispering fireside lore. Yes, even during what felt like the world's longest winter, there was a kind of quiet enchantment, a sense that time itself had climbed under a blanket with the settlers and was gently nodding off next to the hearth. Outside, the snow fell in hushed confessionals, each flake an apologetic reminder that spring was now a concept, not a forecast. But inside, the soup steamed, the fire crackled, and someone began to tell the tale once again of the great icicle incident of 14. Because even if the land slumbered in frost, the human spirit kept the coals of curiosity just warm enough to glow. And soon, those same settlers would face February, the longest short month of all. As the first snowflakes tiptoed down from a sheep's wool sky, the little settlement began to vanish beneath winter's quiet hush. Roofs wore snow like bonnets, each log cabin blushing under its white frosting, and the trees stood proud like frosted candles on a cake no one quite dared to cut. Inside those timbered shelters, life shifted into a slower, deeper rhythm, as if all of nature had tucked itself in for a delightful nap, and humanity rather wisely followed suit. Though early settlers often braved unthinkable hardship, this time of year called for a surprisingly refined art of doing not very much at all, just with great intention. Wintertime brought not just the threat of frostbite, but also something even more dangerous: boredom. And so, in an age before television, TikTok, or even the noble crossword puzzle, winter leisure took on a peculiar kind of creativity. Let's start with storytelling. The original Netflix binge. Families would gather near the hearth, a misbehaving kettle spitting from its hook, and listen to Granny or Uncle Thomas recount deeply suspicious tales about wolves that spoke Latin, or mysterious strangers who faultlessly predicted turnip yields. Stories grew taller each season, and no one corrected anything. After all, Uncle Thomas had only one good eye and most of his teeth, but apparently a direct line to supernatural agriculture insight. Children, having been thoroughly windburned by the morning's chores, huddled by the fire, clutching wooden dolls, scruffy kittens, or one another. Sometimes they entertained themselves by practicing their alphabets with a lump of coal on rough wooden boards. Others learned to knit, often producing scarves at least 6 feet too long, or suspiciously shaped socks that could only fit a goat. Beyond the cozy storytelling and wildly interpretive knitting, winter was also when settlers turned to mending. Everything was mended: clothes, tools, furniture, relationships hastily strained during the harvest season. Long-standing grudges softened in the presence of hot cider and the shared act of re-thatching a chicken roost from the inside out. Now, food played an essential role in surviving the winter, not just in terms of calories, but comfort. For all their stoicism, settlers were sentimental about their pickles, their preserves, and particularly their pies. The root cellar, a sort of underground treasure stash, where potatoes lay nestled like sleeping infants, became the silent hero of the season. Every meal was a variation on what survived best in the dark. Carrots, onions, and cabbages found ways to co-star nightly with salt pork, like regional dinner theatre. Supplies were carefully rationed, of course. 1 biscuit per person, 1 candle per room, unless someone was giving birth, writing to Congress, or reading Leviticus in Latin for fun. And while coffee was rare, homemade substitutes abounded. Roasted acorns, dried chicory root, or sometimes just very ambitious imagination, paired with boiling water. It was during these long, sound-dampened months that settlers found time to reflect, to stare into the fire and consider big questions, such as, what is the purpose of existence? Or, why does neighbor Eustace insist on singing at dawn with that injured fiddle? Journals were kept, though grammar took a back seat to artistry. Some entries read like poems, others like small panics committed to ink. And then there were the indoor entertainments, low-tech but high replay value. Game boards fashioned from corn husks, riddles involving foxes and chickens crossing rivers in canoes. A winter favorite, the dramatic reading aloud of old almanacs where the weather predictions for last July were treated like suspenseful cliffhangers. Turns out, one settler might murmur with hushed reverence, the farmer's almanac did correctly predict an early frost. Gasps would echo through the fire-lit room. Of course, not all recreation was sensible. There were the infamous frozen beard contests, a test of endurance where men stood outside until their beards turned into miniature chandeliers of ice, or the indoor snowshoe races, banned only after 2 windows and a turnip fermenting barrel fell victim. Through all of this, winter revealed what the settlers were made of. Not just hearty root vegetables and wool, but patience, camaraderie, and a surprisingly vast array of ways to make canned butter seem interesting. And so, as February yawned into March, with icicles slowly dripping like clocks unwinding, the settlers began to sense the fragile hope of spring. Barely. There was still enough snow to lose a cow in, but something was shifting. Next, we slipped softly into the soot-streaked world of chimney sweeps, both literal and metaphorical. And what secrets winter fires may have carried skyward into the silent dark. And so, once the last barrel of salted turnips was tucked in and the window shutters creaked closed against the snarling wind, the settlers turned to their final layer of winter survival. The art of waiting. Not merely enduring, good heavens, no. That would be far too active. What we're talking about is the quiet, seated, occasionally wool-covered patience that only a long winter can demand, and only the truly prepared can master. You see, by this point, perhaps mid-November, though no one was really keeping track outside of notched sticks and a vague sense that their toes were colder than usual, the early colonists had completed the major seasonal tasks. The firewood stacks were high enough to disturb the local bird navigation. The livestock had been negotiated with, bribed with extra hay, and strongly encouraged to survive until spring. The root cellar had taken on that particular smell that only comes when onions, dirt, and slight dread intermingle in a subterranean space. Now, with their labours done, or at least shifted into the kind of maintenance work that could be performed by candlelight while muttering. The settlers devoted themselves to what we might call pre-modern snoozing culture. There were no smartphones to scroll, no podcasts to fall asleep to, except perhaps the rhythmic drip of melting icicles, and no late-night infomercials selling suspicious tonics involving gooseberry extract. The only entertainment came from one another, or more accurately, from mutual exhaustion and the occasional accordion, if someone had made the tactical error of bringing one across the Atlantic. Children, when not being used to test if the stew was adequately seasoned, served as in-house dramatic performers. They would reenact the glorious tales of the harvest, dramatic sagas involving runaway chickens and close escapes from geese with vendettas. Grandparents watched with approval and only interrupted when historical inaccuracies emerged, such as suggesting that turkeys could be trained. They could not, and still cannot. Meanwhile, storytelling was elevated to an ancestral sport. Elders recalled their voyages, their past winters, their loves, losses, and, very often, the precise failures of their neighbours' attempts at building chimneys. Did you know that in 17th century New England, chimney collapses were one of the leading conversation pieces? They were right up there with frostbite, and that one time a neighbour mistook a sleeping bear for an unusually furry husband. Winter waiting was also a time for mending. Socks developed holes faster than morale did, and there's something oddly meditative about stitching wool by firelight, as if each needle thrust tethered you more firmly to the hearth. Quilting bees, though they sound thrilling, were mostly an excuse to gossip in code over the top of slowly assembling bedspreads. "Did you hear about Sarah's squares?" someone might whisper. The implications were thrilling. Scandalous square misalignment. But amidst the giggles and loom chatter, there existed a deeper sense of seasonal valor. The idea that rest, true rest, that put your feet up on a warm cat, sought, was not laziness, it was wisdom. The early settlers, for all their quirks, had figured out something modern people are only now rediscovering through expensive retreats and herbal teas, that the cold season is a time not just to survive, but to slow down, to steep yourself like a good mug of cider in silence and stillness. Sleep came early, and often more than once. Winter sleep, pre-electricity, was a curious two-part affair. First sleep would begin after the evening meal, with everyone bedding down under layers of what can only be described as scratchy optimism. Then, after a few hours, they'd wake in the night, just for a bit, for talking, reading, perhaps petting a wary cat, or adding another twig to the fire. Then came second sleep. It's frankly astonishing how humans forgot this middle-of-the-night intermission existed, as if centuries of yawning anthropology simply drifted off. Outside, the snow would continue to fall like whispered dreams. Icicles grew like the kingdom of Narnia's jagged pretenders. The forest stood in deep, respectful silence, blanketed in a dignity that only winter knows how to wear. And inside those thick log walls, beneath roofs patched with hope and moss, the settlers practiced the ancient, quiet ritual of trusting that spring would eventually arrive. And if it didn't, well, at least the quilts were very snug. Because when you're in the heart of winter's slumber, halfway between a whistling kettle and someone humming in their sleep, warmth becomes more than temperature. It becomes a philosophy. And speaking of cozy philosophies, let us wander next toward the curious winter rituals of celebration. Yes, even in the middle of frost and famine, some colonists still insisted on throwing a party. There was a moment, sometime in mid-December, right after the bread started tasting like damp firewood and the candle wax became more valuable than gossip. When the early settlers across New England realized they weren't just passing time, they were surviving it. And yet, in their own peculiar way, they found warmth not just beside the hearth, but in the odd routines and rituals that cold weather invited. Whether it was sealing windows with wool from a sheep they'd known personally, or assigning one child in the household the noble title of firewood fetcher, a job both prestigious and perilously frostbitten, they managed. The day began before the sun did, or at least that's how it always felt. A faint light would rise over snow-blanketed fields like a yawn from the sky itself, and inside low-ceilinged cabins, muffled by snowdrifts and itchy insulation stuffed with old straw, settlers stirred. There was no such thing as sleeping in, unless you were the family cat or Mr. Williams from down the lane who claimed he could milk cows in his dreams. Before breakfast, if such a feast existed that day, came the ritual of relighting the fire, a task requiring finesse, reverence, and a certain comfort with disappointment. A good fire meant a bit of warmth and a place to heat whatever had been soaking in a pot overnight, stew, porridge, or in some unfortunate households, shoe leather softened with bay leaves. Waste not, want not, especially when hooves were considered at least a two-course affair. Children were kept close, layered in hand-me-downs and despair, and assigned practical tasks like carding wool, watching the pot, literally in case of bubbles, or reciting psalms between bouts of complaining. Their toys were mostly sticks, which doubled as swords, dolls, or, on very special days, makeshift snow brushes for the roof. Now, let's turn briefly to a frequently misunderstood figure of the cold season. The humble night commode, fashioned from wood, ironstone, and silent desperation. Toilets being an outdoor luxury, the chamber pot was invited indoors for the season, becoming perhaps the most respected member of the furniture, especially when the outhouse resembled a snow-encased nightmare with splinters. Meanwhile, food storage transformed into something akin to slow-motion gambling. Root cellars held potatoes that doubled as currency and squash that could outlive 3 generations. Apples were dried or turned to cider, which in turn could be fermented into poor man's brandy, a beverage that both warmed the body and temporarily made one forget they were living in frostbitten purgatory. And somewhere behind the rows of knobbly food storage and pickled things that no one was enthusiastic to eat was the secret luxury: molasses. Sweet and sticky, molasses had the mystical ability to turn anything, cornmeal, beans, even small regrets, into the suggestion of dessert. A spoonful after dinner was believed to cure melancholy, boredom, and modesty, and more importantly, ensured you'd be asked to dinner again. Clothing morphed into armor against invisible tempests. Wool, homespun and heavy as gilt, was the mainstay. Even indoors, settlers wore mittens attached to their sleeves with bits of string, like oversized toddlers wholly prepared for winter or spontaneous snowball diplomacy. Socks, hand-knit by candlelight, were layered until you could no longer feel your toes, which was sort of the point. And if you had only one coat for the entire family, it was passed on like a ceremonial garb, adopted by whoever stepped outside, even briefly, to fetch firewood, check the roof, or yell obscenities at particularly bold squirrels. What's especially touching, what really lingers in the lull of these cold pages of history, is the quiet choreography of community. Neighbors visited when snowpaths allowed, traveling on sleds or makeshift snowshoes fashioned from bent saplings and stubbornness. They brought jelly jars, seed cakes, and stories, as if nourishing one another with the very sound of a friendly voice. It wasn't just about preserving food, it was about preserving each other. And when the snow fell thick and the wind howled like a cranky choir, families gathered close by the hearth, telling tales passed down like hand-knit scarves, some true, some invented, and all coloured warmly so the cold would feel a little farther away. Outside, the world froze in silence and starlight. Inside, the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair, the slow drift of wood smoke, and the gentle breathing of those tucked into quilts made from 100 old shirts wrapped the night in peace. And just when life seemed suspended in snowy slumber, something quietly shifted, an icicle beginning to drip, a change in the birdsong, a slipper misplaced but melted where it fell, something that hinted at an approaching thaw, or just the next strange twist in this slow, shivering march through time. As the long shadows of the early settlers' final autumn days stretched across the packed earth floors of their crooked cabins, there was a quiet kind of knowing in the air. A hush passed down from pine to hearth to the glint of frost forming, unnoticed, on the inside of the windows. The winter was coming. Of course it was. It always came. But each year it felt a little more like a test set by some unseen arbiter in the clouds, an exam in patience planning, and the fine art of not turning your neighbours into soup. By December's arrival, the woodshed, assembled from 347 nails, 12 curse words, and one spirited misunderstanding about measurement systems, was full, though never quite as full as anyone wanted it to be. Firewood had become an existential concept by this point, like love or good shoes. Everyone needed it. Nobody dared run out, and arguments over its management had ended more than one marriage and at least 3 barn raisings. The root cellar, carved into the earth like a cozy, squash-scented tomb, lay beneath the homestead, stuffed with the autumn's stubborn bounty. Potatoes, roughened by soil but honest as anything, lay in cool rows beside parsnips that could double as impromptu clubs, turnips for days, apples that had begun to shrug into a cider-scented slumber, squash looking like it had been designed by illustrators of fairy tales. Every shelf politely groaned under the weight of boiled preserves and the quiet desperation of pickled things. If it could be salted, jammed, brined, or dried with squinting optimism, it had been. The men, bundled in wool like ambulatory sheep with tools, passed the time mending harnesses and pretending not to hear their children while carving new handles for well-worn tools. Meanwhile, women waged daily war with soot, dough, and frostbite, unleashing biscuits that gave a person hope and mittens knit tightly enough to stop a cannonball. Idle hands were rare. Idle thoughts belonged mostly to the chickens, who were admittedly terrible philosophers. Nightfall began at 1:30 lunch. Lamps were lit and shadows danced across walls in long performative interpretations of boredom. It was then that stories, glorious, meandering, totally unverifiable stories, seeped into circulation like the slow pour of molasses on a freezing day. Tales of ancestors who outran wolves on snowshoes, of ghosts in the privy, and of that one fellow who tried to build a thermometer out of squirrel bones. No one ever said the frontier was a center of scientific accuracy. Snow, when it came, answered no invitation. It arrived like a long-lost relative with a lot of luggage and absolutely no intention of leaving quietly. It blanketed the land, softened the air, and made even the outhouse look poetic. until you had to use it at 3 in the morning with your breath fogging thick enough to sketch a still life in. Blizzard days were spent clearing a path from the porch to the woodpile so that one could warm up from round 1 of freezing by round 2 of starting the fire. It was less a cycle and more a delicate balance between combustion and complaining. Winter didn't knock. It moved into the guest room and drank all your tea. And yet, somehow, those early settlers endured. Not because they enjoyed the challenge, or because porridge again really sparked joy, but because their stubbornness was cultivated like a second crop. What they lacked in convenience, they made up for in a fierce kind of hope. That spring would come, that maple sap would rise, that sleds would give way to ploughs, and that perhaps this year the potatoes would actually sprout in straight rows. Children grew taller, if not wiser, and the elderly grew wiser, even as they shrank. Seasons moved not in leaps, but in the soft murmurings of calendars turned by lantern light, and stories repeated so many times they transcended fact and became family artifacts. Life simple yet always improvising, like a fiddle player who never quite tuned the strings but still played on. So as we drift now toward the hearth one last time, with the snow still falling outside in sagging, satisfied heaps, think of those who came before, not as pioneers or heroes or historic bullet points, but as dreamers in wool socks, stubbornly whispering their way through a winter that might have lasted forever. Let the snow pile high, let the fire crackle low, and rest now. The wilderness waits, but so does morning. Eventually,